So my topic is extraterrestrial disclosure, the end time delusion, as a question mark. And, it's a question mark because, I don't claim to know how this is going to play out. But I do think that this is a very credible explanation for how certain things could fall into place very quickly. One thing I can say for sure is that the argument that I'm going to present to you today, that's in this presentation, I wrote it up in a research paper for an advanced eschatology class at Liberty Baptist Theological Seminary, turned it into a PhD. He graded it. I got an A+. He approved of it. He liked it. He gave all kinds of good comments about it. So I've submitted this material to peer review from a qualified theologian, and he accepted it. So I can guarantee you I'm not going to be teaching you any heresies or any of these kind of wild accusations I've seen on the internet. But, and the big idea is that, Jesus predicted a great deception right before his return. Amongst a lot of Christians in the West, the demons and the demonic realm has really been what we call demythologized. They've kind of explained it all away. And people don't really believe in those sort of things too much anymore. They think it's all superstition. So, the Bible predicts, an unparalleled demonic deception just prior to Christ's return. Now, if over half the church no longer believes in demons, they're ripe for this deception. Now, a lot of people kind of have this idea that Satan and the demons are in hell, or they have this kingdom under the earth in hell or something. And I think that probably comes more from things like Dante's Inferno than it does the Bible. If you look in Ephesians chapter 2, it calls Satan the prince of the power of the air. Now, but biblical scholars are pretty much in agreement that this was meant to be literal. The Jewish view of the realm of the demons was really the sky between the earth and the moon, our atmosphere. Okay, so this idea of the prince of the power of the air is quite literal. Here's a biblical scholar writing in a commentary. He says, in the New Testament, the air is the realm of the demonic. The concept of the rapture of the church comes from the Latin translation of 1 Thessalonians 4:17, caught up. Christians are going to meet the Lord in the midst of Satan's kingdom, the air, to show its overthrow. I thought that was kind of a neat line. So, L.A. Marzulli came up with a kind of an interesting idea in his book, Politics, Prophecy, and Supernatural, where he thought that perhaps right in this time in the 40s, it seems to be the pivotal thing in the UFO thing, that perhaps what Hitler and the SS were doing opened up some sort of entryway for the demonic realm. Because this is really when we see this big outburst of UFOs, right at the time that he was slaughtering millions of Jews. Here's a quote from Nelson Pacheco, who was in the Air Force, a lieutenant colonel who studied the phenomenon. It's interesting that a lot of secular researchers have come to the same conclusion. J. Allen Hynek was an astronomer who was in charge of Project Blue Book for the Air Force in the 1960s, came to the same idea. He called them psycho-spiritual. Jacques Vallée is a French astrophysicist and computer scientist who worked with Hynek at the same time, came to the same idea. They don't think they're space aliens. They don't. And these are highly qualified astronomers who have studied all the evidence. They came to the idea that these things are indigenous to the planet Earth, but are somehow extra-dimensional, okay? And I think that kind of fits the paradigm that I'm talking about when we talk about things kind of coming from the demonic realm, which we believe in as Christians. Now, if you're skeptical about the overall UFO phenomenon, some of this might be new to some of you, here's 3 books that I recommend that are really well-researched and by very qualified people. The first one's by a historian named Richard Dolan. Now, Richard Dolan believes in aliens, okay? This is a secular guy, but he has really cataloged this. There's 2 books, UFOs, the National Security State. He's gone through all kinds of classified and declassified government documents and makes a really strong case that the government is aware of something really strange going on. The next book in the middle there is by Leslie Kean. She's a journalist, but she interviewed pilots, generals, government officials, all very highly qualified people, really solid cases. very convincing, not the kind of people that you would think were making it up or hallucinating. The third book I have up there is called Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men. And this is a Christian apologist named Hugh Ross. He's an astrophysicist with a PhD. And he came to basically the same conclusion that I did, that these are probably demonic manifestations. Governor of Arizona, Fife Symington, who was in the Air Force himself, described seeing a craft that was nearly a mile wide that flew over Phoenix in the 1990s. 1997, hundreds of people saw this. And so here we have a really highly qualified, the governor of the state, who had been in the Air Force, saying that as a pilot and former Air Force officer, I can say with certainty that this craft did not resemble any man-made object I'd ever seen. Something really huge. Now, I don't know what this was. And sometimes I wonder if it was a government psychological warfare operation, just something that maybe they developed to scare the enemies to death. Because, literally, if you saw the movie Independence Day, big, huge spaceships flying over major cities, that's what this was like. You can look it up on the internet and read about it. Hundreds of people saw a huge triangle fly over Phoenix. Our government is not telling us anything about what happened. The alien abduction phenomenon. Here's the book that really got this in the public consciousness. It was called Communion. It was by Whitley Strieber. It was published in 1987. I remember reading that. This was before I even became a Christian, and it scared me. And it really describes him, his interactions with non-human entities that just invaded his life. Now, a lot of Christians have addressed this phenomenon, and there's several ministries that are, but here's a book by Joseph Jordan and David Rufino called Unholy Communion. And what they found was that people that did repent and become Christians, that had this phenomenon going on in their life, they could rebuke it in the name of Jesus Christ, and it would stop. All right? Now, what does that tell you? Well, if it's aliens doing scientific testing, doesn't seem like that would stop it, does it? No. I think it's very suggestive that it is demonic. And many people had come to those conclusions. Now, here's a quote from that book. We think that the abduction is a major part of the strong delusion that has come upon the earth. It fits perfectly into the end-time scenario and is a wonderful way to pull people away from the true God and point mankind to a false Messiah who will deceive the whole world. So this is what Jordan and David Rufino wrote. John Mack, this is a psychiatrist from Harvard University, all right? He's a secular guy, well-respected, won a Pulitzer Prize. He risked his career and his standing at Harvard to take on this alien abduction phenomenon. After doing interviews and working with over 100 abductees, he really found a remarkable coherence in their stories. And what I mean by that is people who didn't know each other, didn't know anything about each other, they all had a core story that was so similar that he couldn't explain that. And he came to the conclusion that something very real was going on, but perhaps not something entirely physical, okay? And so you can see the quote that I have here, something that's not generally accepted as existing by Western science. It seems to be of this visible non-material universe, yet appears to manifest in it. Now, that's a secular person doing the best he can to describe a spiritual entity, is what it sounds like to me. Some abductees feel that certain beings seem to want to take their souls from them. Greg told me that the terror of his encounters with certain reptilian beings was so intense that he feared being separated from his soul. Now, that doesn't sound like advanced scientific extraterrestrials, examining us. Whitley Strieber, the guy that got it all started, here's a quote from his next book, Transformation. Whatever was there seemed so monstrously ugly, so filthy, so dark and sinister. Of course they were demons. They had to be. And they were here, and I couldn't get away. This is from Jacques Vallée. In the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind, there was a little short French scientist. That character was based on Jacques Vallée. Jacques Vallée is a real guy, has a master's degree in astrophysics and a PhD in computer science, has written many books about UFOs and several about the alien abduction phenomenon. Now, I thought this quote is very telling. The medical examination to which abductees are said to be subjected is often accompanied by sadistic sexual manipulation that is reminiscent of medieval tales of encounters with demons. It makes no sense in a sophisticated or technical framework. Any intelligent being equipped with the scientific marvels UFOs possess would be in a position to achieve any of these alleged scientific objectives in a shorter time and with fewer risks. So what he's saying is, from a scientific perspective, if you're an advanced extraterrestrial race, you don't need to be going around abducting people out of their houses at night and doing the sorts of things that these people describe. Now, Jacques Vallée has another idea, and I really wrote about this in our book, Exo Vaticana, because he doesn't believe that these are aliens. He thinks that they're from somewhere close by, and he calls it a control system. And what he means by that is that he thinks that these beings are trying to influence people's worldviews. They're trying to influence the belief structures of humans, and they're trying to steer us in a certain direction. And he doesn't really seem to know what that is, but he thinks that that's the purpose of it. And I think that's a very interesting idea in light of the sorts of things that we see in the New Testament. Paul talks about the God of this world who blinds the minds of unbelievers. Now, there's a verse where Paul says, don't be held captive to vain philosophies and empty deceit. According to some translations say elementary principles of the world. Some say elemental spirits of the world. Now, the Greek word is stoicheia, and that really meant spiritual entities. It's really the same thing as the powers and principalities that you see in Ephesians chapter 6. In the ancient world, these stoicheia were seen as like sort of influential demonic or angelic beings that really did influence the world. So, even our translations tend to demythologize some of these things sometimes. So elemental spirits is a better reading in that passage. And what that passage is really saying is that a lot of the vain philosophies and empty deceits that people believe originate from something extra-human. I think the strong delusion is already here in a sense because this survey came out in the United Kingdom in 2012 where more people believe in extraterrestrials than God. That's the way it is in Europe right now. In the United States, 36% of Americans, about 80 million people, believe that UFOs are visiting Earth. A 2008 survey said that 1/3 of adults believe it's very likely or somewhat likely that intelligent extraterrestrials have visited Earth. Even more, 56% say it's very likely or somewhat likely that intelligent life exists on other planets. And 1 in 12 said that they had personally seen a UFO that they think might be an alien spaceship. Carl Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist. He's the father of analytical psychology. He wrote about the UFO phenomenon in the 1950s, right when it was kind of getting its wings. Now, of course, he has a very secular, not a Christian worldview at all, but I think some of his insights were pretty interesting. He said that UFOs could be conceived as gods. He noticed that people were treating them that way. The movie Expelled, this was about intelligent design. And really the idea behind the movie was a lot of biologists and college professors that do believe in intelligent design were losing their jobs because the naturalist mainstream really can't tolerate any diversion from the status quo worldview. Now, there was somewhat of a confrontation between Ben Stein and the world's most famous atheist, Richard Dawkins, who's an Oxford zoologist. He wrote the book, The God Delusion. Interestingly, when Ben Stein cornered him, on the origin of life, and Dawkins said, well, we don't really know how it started. Well, he said, well, is there any possibility that intelligent design could explain the origin of life? And what did Dawkins do? He went right for panspermia. It could be that sometime earlier, somewhere in the universe, a civilization evolved, probably by some kind of Darwinian means, probably to a very high level of technology, and designed a form of life that they seeded onto this planet. So here we have, the world's most outspoken atheist who says that we're delusional, telling us that we are created by aliens. Dr. Michael Heiser He's a biblical scholar. He's a Semitic languages expert. He actually had him for Old Testament in seminary. He's the academic editor for Logos Bible Software, and he also tracks this UFO phenomenon. He's got a blog called UFO Religions. But he wrote on panspermia, and I thought his quote was really interesting. He says, "It paves the way for a true merging of science and religion. It will be the paradigm that allows the atheist to tolerate religion and allows literalist Bible readers, the Eastern Buddhist, and the pagan to simultaneously parse the new science the same way. This might, in turn, be useful fodder for a global religion." That's really interesting to me. What he's saying is, this idea that perhaps we were seeded on the earth by aliens would be a unifying element that could bring all these divergent worldviews together. This is Dr. Timothy Daly. He's a senior fellow at the Family Research Council. Pretty sober fellow. He wrote a book called The Millennial Deception. And, he was looking at this UFO phenomenon about the same way that Tom and myself have and others. Men and women are being deceived into accepting a non-Christian worldview. And for what purpose? The way is being prepared for the ultimate appearance of Antichrist. Dr. Daly concluded that we're witnessing a masterful satanic subterfuge that appears to involve the appearance of angels and aliens. Many are asking, can the coming of Antichrist be far removed? And this takes us back to the main thesis that I gave you at the beginning, that belief in spiritually superior extraterrestrial beings uniquely provides a credible basis for everyone, from secular scientists, from Richard Dawkins, right, all the way across the whole spectrum of religious belief, New Agers, Buddhists, whoever, to accept an individual who claims deity. And that's what the Antichrist is going to do. Now, we look at these prophecies. He blasphemes God. They call him the man of sin or the man of lawlessness. He opposes God. He sits in the temple proclaiming himself to be God. When I look at all those prophecies, it's really hard for me to believe that Richard Dawkins is going to worship the Antichrist as a god. It really is. But what if the Antichrist is a man that has some kind of connection to these aliens that Richard Dawkins thinks are really advanced, technological marvels or whatever? I think that has a lot more power to explain how everyone could fall under the spell of that. Now, it's interesting. The Bible does say during the tribulation that Satan and his angels are going to be thrown down to earth. Now, there's some debate about this passage, but I think that's going to occur sometime, right in the few years before Jesus appears. And perhaps aliens will be the explanation for their appearance. I don't know, but that would probably work. Interestingly, in the book of Daniel, it talks about the Antichrist worshiping a god of fortresses. Now, biblical scholars, there's been some debate on what this was talking about. Nobody really knows. I mean, there's been speculations on various pagan deities, but it says that he's going to honor a foreign god. Now, the Hebrew is Elohim ha-nakar, and this word nakar, it can mean foreign, but like when we talk about people that come in our country illegal, what do we call them? We call them illegal aliens, right? So could he be saying an alien god? I don't know. Maybe. I'm not saying that Daniel had that in his mind when he wrote that, but the Hebrew text could literally be translated that way. So it would be a legitimate reading that the Antichrist worship a god his fathers did not know, an alien god. I don't know. It's possible. People in the UFO community, Richard Dolan, the historian I was telling you about before, have noticed that there's been one church who has stood up and has taken their place in the front of the line. He says the world's largest church seems to be positioning itself at the forefront of disclosure. The Vatican has long maintained several astronomical observatories and a collection of radio telescopes. In recent years, its hierarchy has stated in one form or another that we have company. Perhaps they know something is afoot or suspect its inevitability. So there's a wealth of evidence suggesting this conclusion. So here, Tom and I are walking up the road toward the large binocular telescope. This is the most powerful telescope in the world. They told us it gets sharper images than the Hubble Space Telescope. Okay, and it's way out in space on a satellite. Now, how is that possible? Here's the director of the Vorg in the 1990s, right when that went online. He gave a bunch of interviews, and one thing that he said I thought was rather startling is that he was going to ask extraterrestrials if they had ever experienced something like Adam and Eve, in other words, original sin. And so, I mean, I don't know what they're thinking. You know, right when their observatory goes online, he gives these interviews and starts talking about extraterrestrials, and he mentioned baptizing them as well. And, you know, he's a PhD astronomer, but, you know, it's not too fanciful for Tom and I to be asking the sorts of questions we are in our book, Exo Vaticana, because they've gone out in the media and said these things. So here's the Large Binocular Telescope. Now, you can see there's two huge mirrors. That's why they call it binocular. And, of course, this is the Lucifer instrument, which is part of the Large Binocular Telescope. And this is where you'll see all kinds of interesting articles on the internet about the Jesuits on top of Mount Graham with a telescope named Lucifer. It sounds really fantastic. It really stands, it's an acronym, but I think it's rather forced. It stands for Large Binocular Telescope, Near Infrared Spectroscopic Utility with Camera and Integral Field Unit for Extragalactic Research. Okay. So, yeah, somebody went to pretty exorbitant lengths to shoehorn that in so they could say Lucifer, didn't they? Now, the idea that there are no Vatican UFO secrets. This is Daniel Sheehan, who was an attorney. He's got degrees from Harvard. He's tried many famous cases. The Karen Silkwood case, Iran-Contra, 3 Mile Island, Watergate. He was working for President Carter and tried to get the Jesuit. He was the lead counsel for the Jesuit order and was requested to get the Vatican UFO documents. Here's some testimony that he gave just this year, just a few months ago.
Carter asked to be briefed by the Director of Central Intelligence on the issue of UFOs. And in that meeting, CIA Director Bush asked the President-elect if the President-elect would leave him in as the Central Intelligence Agency Director. And that he would promise that he would never run for political office in his life if Carter would agree to keep him in as the director of the CIA. Bush wanted to, at that time, become more or less like J. Edgar Hoover, had become at the FBI, that he would remain, that it would be above politics, that he would remain in that position. President Carter reiterated his request for the UFO information, saying that he had his own person in mind to be the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, which happened to be Teddy Sorensen at the time. And Bush at that time then refused to provide the information to him, saying that he did not have adequate clearances, he was not the president yet, and that he should ask his own Central Intelligence Agency director for that. But if he wanted to have the information ahead of time, that what he could do is he could contact the Science and Technology Committee of the House of Representatives, and that they had an ongoing relationship with the Science and Technology Division of the Congressional Research Service that could go about getting things declassified to show him. That is what generated the request from the Congressional Research Service to me as the General Counsel for the Jesuit headquarters in the United States, asking if I could gain access to the Vatican Library to obtain the information that the Vatican has in its library, in its classified sections, to deliver to the President for his review. I did that. I contacted the Jesuit, who happens to be the head of the Vatican Library, requesting this information. And much to my surprise, I was denied information.
So there you go. What do we make of that? You know, obviously they do have something to hide. He was the lead counsel for the Jesuit Order of the United States. He requested the information from the Vatican Library for the president's eyes, you know, for the United States president, and was refused. So here's our book, Exo Vaticana. I've only scratched the surface. I've just kind of laid the foundation